What's going on, guys? Welcome to The Reformed Reader, the channel where we review different forms of media through the lens of a Christian who is under the authority of the scriptures. And today I'm going to go over my top 10 reading list of 2024. So this year I read a total of 50 books. That includes the books that I DNF'd, but a lot of them were series. So it was a little bit more difficult to pick a singular book from each individual author rather than pick 3 or 4 books out of a series. So the rules I set for myself are 1 book per author and no rereads. And I've got 2 honorable mentions. So let's start with the first honorable mention, which is Kaiju number 8. The entire manga series, I think I had started reading maybe in March, and I got caught up with the writer in May. And so I think I read the first 10 volumes in its completion. And then once I caught up with the author, I kind of just stopped and never really picked it back up. So I will probably pick that back up at some point, but I don't know when. It was really good. It wasn't good enough to make it in my top 10 list. Plus, it's kind of hard for me to put a manga series into my top 10 of the novels that I've read. So the second honorable mention is Leviathan by Darius Hinks. This was my first novel that got me started into the Warhammer series. I started getting pretty interested in the Warhammer lore. We have a local Warhammer store in Huntsville. I walked in and kind of just asked where to start. And essentially the answer that I was given was you can start anywhere, but if you're looking for the same kind of fast-paced action that I was getting from the Space Marine 2 game, then he recommended Leviathan, which is where we follow basically one group on this planet that is trying to defend it against the Tyranids. It seemed very similar. It read very similar to the way that the Space Marine 2 campaign played out. So it was really good. And there's a review for all of these books coming. It was really good, but it didn't quite make its way onto the list. So let's start with number 10. Number 10 is World War Z by Max Brooks. This one was a little hard for me to actually put it on this list because at first I think I only gave it like 3 stars on Goodreads. I think I maybe gave it like a 7 out of 10. And it's a good novel, but I'm not crazy, or I wasn't crazy about the writing style, because you're reading, they're essentially interviews of survivors of the zombie apocalypse. And so the interviewer is going from different people with different perspectives to get them to tell you the story. And then he kind of lays it out linearly. He basically starts of what they think was the cause of the outbreak, and they kind of lead to where civilization was able to kind of regain some footing. But the reason why it's so low on the list, but also why it was difficult for me to put it on this list, is because I really struggled with it at first. I really wasn't crazy about it. I mean, it was pretty good. I liked the stories that were being told, but they seemed disconnected. But the more time that I've had away from it, the more that it has steeped into my mind, where I find myself thinking about it just at random. I find myself thinking about, oh, that was a really cool part. So I've actually bumped it up since then. Number 9 is going to be Eragon by Christopher Paolini. Now, a large reason why this made it onto my list is because of why I read it. My son wanted to start reading Eragon. We wanted to do a buddy read. I never read the books, and the story is very tropey, not in a bad way. It's very much farm boy to hero, dragon rider fantasy. That I've read several series that follow that same path as far as the story goes, one of which being Ryan Cahill's story is very similar. This is definitely aimed at a younger audience. So it was good, but it was fun to get to read it alongside my son, and then us get to talk about it. And I think that the review of that will actually be coming pretty soon, where he and I will actually get to discuss some of this. So that made it onto my number 9. Number 8 is Prince Caspian by C.S. Lewis. This one was another one that I kind of struggled with because I'd seen the movie. I thought the movie did a pretty good job. The book is a lot better in many ways, but there were several lulls in the book that I wasn't crazy about. This seems to occur in a few of the Narnia books where I'll be reading for chapters and chapters and almost be bored, but then there'll be one line that Lewis puts in there that just is a home run and makes it worth reading all of those chapters. So Prince Caspian, it was good. It was good enough to make it on my top 10 list, but I definitely don't think it is my favorite of the novels. So far, it is Magician's Nephew, and I hope to finish up the entire series this year. Number 7 is Recursion by Blake Crouch. I read Dark Matter at the end of 2023. It was the next to last book that I read in 2023. I think I read it in like 2 days in December. Dark Matter is one of my favorite sci-fi books of all time. And this one was a close second. Blake Crouch does such a good job of taking a concept and really fleshing it out and showing you. He answers all the what if questions that you have while you're reading it. So with this, it deals a little bit with time, maybe time travel, but really it's like different dimension type things. It's really neat. It answers the question kind of what if this happened, what if that. So Blake Crouch does a really good job. I don't want to spoil anything, and it's very difficult to talk about this book without talking about any kind of spoilers. He does an excellent job of getting you to ask the question and then answering the question before you even know to ask it. Number 6 is going to be Soul Cage by Luke Scholes. Now, there is a dedicated review coming out. It should be out by the time this video is out. This was my only indie pub book of the year. Luke actually sent me an e-arc of it. I read it on my Kindle, but I enjoyed it so much that I actually bought the physical copy. And this was another one of those where it was a 4-star book for me. There was a couple little hiccups that I had with it, but it wasn't in the storytelling or the characters or anything like that. It was really just a couple stylistic choices with the writing that wasn't a preference of mine that began to hold it back at first. But this is another one of those books where over time, being able to sit with it, I catch myself thinking about it and looking forward to book 2 so much that I bumped it up to a 5-star read for the year. Please support Luke if you can. It's a good book. I describe it as like a grimdark light Stormlight meets Highlander. And so if that sounds like it's kind of up your alley, this is definitely the book for you. And number 5 is The Justice of Kings by Richard Swan. It was very difficult for me to pick which book in the trilogy to put on this list. Justice of Kings has been recommended by so many different people on YouTube that I had to pick it up. And I was watching one of John Minton over at Talking Story. The patrons on his Patreon page actually had him read this book. So I thought it'd be neat. I've never done a read along before. So I was like, well, I'll read this along with him and see how it is. And I flew through this book. It was so good. It was kind of a grim fantasy world, but it was almost like a fantasy light. There really wasn't a ton of a magic system or anything in there. There's a little bit, obviously, but it was more of like a detective story, like a noir kind of fantasy tale where a justice of the king is trying to solve a murder. So this is an excellent read. And again, I had a difficult time picking which of the 3 to put on here. I don't think I have a favorite. I like them all the same. I like them all equally, but each one of them are very different books. And I will be picking up his new book in February. I actually have that one from the Broken Binding coming, Grave Empire. So I'm looking forward to it so much. I like the series so much that's going to probably be another day one read for me. Then at number 4, I have The Shadow of What Was Lost by James Islington. This book really surprised me for a bunch of reasons. You know, I'd heard a lot about it. I heard it deals in a lot of time travel, but really this book focuses on destiny. And as I'm reading the book, you know, I'm really getting invested in the characters. It's a pretty thick book, and there's sort of a ramp that Islington has to go up where he begins to build the world. He tells you about the characters, and then things start to happen. And so it was sort of that slow progression that ramps up to this big event at the end of the book. But the thing that really surprised me and in a good way was there's a conversation about a third of the way through the book where he's sitting around, our characters are sitting around a campfire and they're talking about destiny and predestination. And while I'm sitting there reading, it's a presentation of Reformed theology in a fantasy world. And so I'm reading this book. I think my wife was reading the book at the same time. I've got my earbuds in or something, and I'm over there grinning. And I look up and I said, "This guy's a Reformed Christian." And since then, I've shown that section and I've read that to some Christian brothers and friends of mine, and they start cracking up because of how sound this real doctrine is that he has made sort of the core of this story. And so it was really cool to see that. I'm not just fangirling or gushing over this one piece of the book. The whole book is excellent, but that one part of it made me so encouraged to continue to read and to continue to support and read his books, especially considering kind of the climate of fantasy fiction right now. It's just difficult for me, or it's rare that I pick up a book and am pleasantly surprised of the theology or the ideology that is presented in the book. And this was one of them. Shadow of What Was Lost by James Islington. Excellent book, and definitely go support him. So number 3 was Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This was, I think, my only classic book that I read for the year. I read it in October. I did it basically as a follow-up buddy read with John Minton over at Talking Story. This was not what I expected either. I have known about the Frankenstein story for a long time, but I've never actually read it firsthand. So, when people think Frankenstein, they tend to think the monster and people driving it out of town with pitchforks and things like that. But what you get is you don't get this monster that's dumb and just completely unintelligent or with a soulless creature. Instead, you get the opposite of that. You still have a monster that's grotesque in appearance, but he really has a lot of depth to him. It was surprising in a good way that this book was more philosophical than I thought it would be. It really reminded me of, there's a line in Jurassic Park in the movie where Ian Malcolm says, "All of you were so worried about whether or not you could, no one ever stopped and asked whether or not we should." And that's sort of the overarching theme of this book. Number 2 is Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb. So this is book 2 in the Farseer trilogy. I've read book 1. It was my last book of 2023. And then I went straight into book 2. So this was the first book I finished in 2024, and it did not disappoint me. It was so good. Her writing, she's probably one of my favorite fantasy authors of all time, just with these first 3 books, because I haven't read anything since then. I plan to do more this year. But this is another one of those series where I could have put any of the 3 on here, I think. Probably, I would probably say I like book 1 and 2 more than I did book 3. But book 2 was just so, it pulled you in. It got its hooks in. You wanted to keep reading to the next chapter, but you know that each chapter that she was going to do something terrible to Fitz, but so you were kind of not looking forward to seeing what was happening, but you had to know what happened next. It was such a fantastic book. So I plan on doing the Live Ship Traders trilogy. I think I'm probably going to start around April or May, because everybody's telling me that it's a nautical fantasy. And so I think sort of that time of the year would work well with reading those next 3 books. And I'm not in a rush to finish any of these, especially when it's like a 15-book series. I'm probably going to read these 3, and I may read more after that this coming year, or I may just stick with that and read the next series after. We'll see. But really, the Farseer trilogy as a whole, it showed how good of a writer she can be, and how well she tells a story from the perspective of a young man too. It's kind of mind-boggling how well she can articulate these things on paper. So if you haven't read the Farseer trilogy, I definitely recommend it. And also, it's not a huge commitment. I mean, they're thick books, but if you read book 1 and you look, and there's 15 books in the series, and you're like, I just don't know that I can commit to that because they're all 600-700 pages. I would say you could stop at book 3 and be perfectly happy if you wanted to, or you could stop at book 1. I'd be willing to bet that if you're a fan of fantasy, you'll probably get through these first 3 books and be like I was and want more. So number 1, I kind of cheated, and I'm just going to put Solo Leveling as the entire series at the top of my list. Now, there's going to be some people that are like, well, you just said, that manga is your honorable mention because you can't put it on there. I read the novels of these. I read all, I think there were 8 of them, and I read them back to back. And I finished, I believe I read all 8 novels in like 6 weeks. They were so good. This was one of the best stories, let alone fantasy stories, that I've ever read. There was never a moment where the story lulled for me at all. There were never any dips in quality. And somehow the author figured out how to continually raise the stakes, but there still be conflict, and there still be, or there was still conflict, but it still felt new. But there was also, real stakes. Our character, even though he's supposed to be like this superhuman or whatever, it's not like he didn't have flaws, but somehow the writer was able to just keep elevating the writing. And you can clearly tell that from the first page or the first chapter that he began with the end in mind, and it really showed on paper. So the first 7 books are the actual story, and then I think it's like 10 or 15, 10 to 20% of the last book is the tail end of the story. And then the rest of it is the appendices. And I almost thought about not reading it, but I had a friend of mine that recommended, it's like, no, you have to read it. And I'm so glad that I did. It wraps everything up, but the author does such a good job of giving you answers to questions that you have while still giving you more questions to ask. And then by the end of it, it all got wrapped up so perfectly and succinctly that I can't recommend this series enough. So if you liked Dungeon Crawler Carl, but you want something that's more serious, I know with Dungeon Crawler Carl, it's a little more. It's got some comic relief in it. This does not. This is a brutal kind of dungeon crawler story of somebody that fell into bad circumstances and made the best of it. So Solo Leveling was not only my book of the year, it's my series of the year, and it's probably in my top 10 fantasy series of all time. So with that, that's my top 10 for 2024. I appreciate all of you guys watching and listening. If you're interested in any of these, I'll link these in the description below. And I appreciate you guys watching, and I'll see you next time.